Alright, I was talking about evaluating polynomials before, or evaluating expressions, so let's get some experience actually evaluating these expressions. If we had this expression, this polynomial even, if we had this polynomial and we wanted to evaluate it when x is equal to 2, that just means substituting a value of 2 in for the x. Now, one thing you do need to be careful with when you're doing this is you need to make sure your order of operations works out correctly. It's very easy to accidentally plug stuff in and have it not work out the exact same way as what it's written here, as how it's written here. So in general, whenever I'm making a substitution, what I recommend is to always put that value you're substituting in parentheses. This will guarantee that it's treated in the same way that the x is. So here we have 2 times 2 cubed. Well, 2 cubed is 8. You have to remember your order of operations. Like I said, exponents comes before multiplication, so I'll do 2 times 8. Minus 5 times 4. 2 squared is 4. And then we have, well, a 2 and a negative 3. So I just took the first step, I just dealt with exponents. Next step I'll do 16 minus 20. There's nothing really to do here yet. So then I'm doing multiplication. And lastly, combining these together, well, this is just a adding and subtracting problem. If I wanted to not care about the order that I'm dealing with them in, I can actually treat this as plus a negative 20 and this as plus a negative 3. And this way I can do something like, well, 16 plus 2 is 18, and negative 20 plus negative 3 is negative 23. The reason I would do this is because it's generally easier to add than it is to subtract. And doing 16 minus 20 is negative 4, then adding 2 to that is negative 2, and then subtracting 3 from that is negative 5. That can be a little bit of too much, extra mental gymnastics that you'd have to deal with. Sometimes it's easier to just kind of group the positive numbers together, 16 and 2 to get the 18, and then group the negative numbers together, the 20 and the 3 to get the 23, of course negative, and then do your subtraction as the last step there. Alright, so it wasn't really necessary, or you might not have even really noticed much of a difference of me putting parentheses around these 2's, but especially when we deal with something that's negative, it becomes very important to make sure you put those parentheses, because let me show you what happens. Let's see, negative 3 minus 3. So when we take a negative number and we raise it to a power, if it's in parentheses like this, that entire number is going to be repeated. So this would be negative 3 times negative 3 times negative 3. That would be negative 27. But right here, so minus 5 times, if we're taking negative 3 and we're squaring it, negative 3 times negative 3 is positive 9. So you can see that there's something weird going on with the sign there. And I'll just copy these last 2 down. Then we could continue through this as normal. That's negative 54. Minus 45, minus 3, minus 3. It looks like all the numbers are negative, so I can just kind of add them together. 54 and 45 is 99, minus, or plus 6, whatever. We get negative 105. So basically, let me do a quick little reminder of how, when we're working with the order of operations, especially when negatives are involved, this can get a little bit confusing for people, because it can seem a little ambiguous, but certain rules have already been decided on. So if we had something like this, let's go 2 squared. Of course, that's 2 times 2. If we had negative 2 squared, this is, well, negative 2 times negative 2. This is positive 4. Oh, it's positive 4 as well. If we had this is not negative 2 squared. This is the opposite of 2 squared. So the opposite of, well, this dash comes with multiplication in the order of operations, which means it's going to happen after my exponent. So this opposite of 2 squared is the exact same thing as if I had written it like this. So if I'm saying I'm going to take 2 squared, and then I'm going to change the sign of it. So this is the opposite of, well, 2 squared is 4. So you can see, if we don't have the parentheses there, this thing and that thing evaluate out differently. If you have the parentheses and the negatives on the inside there, we get a positive 4. If you don't have any parentheses whatsoever, we get a negative 4. So let's consider this, because this is another way we might see it. Well, this is another, this is the exact same thing as what we saw in this line right here. This is the opposite of is coming with multiplication. This one right here is coming with an exponent. So this is actually the same as what happened up here. This will end up getting -4 because 2 squared is 4. Then we say take the opposite of it. This pops up a heck of a lot, and I'll guarantee you're going to see it in these polynomial questions, because we're taking a variable raised to a power. Whenever we're plugging in a negative number for that variable, well, we have to consider this, figure out what's happening there. Something else that you might end up seeing is what happens if I say something like the opposite of x squared. Evaluate the opposite of x squared for x equals -3. Alright, so this is another tricky one. I'm going to replace the x with a -3 because that's what my substitution does. So I'm taking the opposite of -3 squared. So if I follow my order of operations, if I'm careful about it, things will work out. What I don't want to do is say, well, I have a negative there and a negative there. Those are going to cancel, because I don't have a negative there and a negative there, or rather, I can't just move them across these parentheses, because those parentheses are doing something. They're saying I have to take this square first. So I'm going to take a -3 and I'm going to square it. I'm just copying down this negative from on the outside. And -3 times -3 is +9. So I get the opposite of, that's this one here, and then the 9. I'm putting in parentheses so you don't just look at that as -9. Of course, it is equal to -9, but that's kind of the next step. We're taking the -3 and squaring it, and that gives us a +9. And then I'm saying I'm going to take the opposite of it, which changes it to a -9. So these problems, especially when we start plugging in negative numbers or when there are negatives in front of my variables, these can be really tricky, so you'll want to be very careful with them. Make sure you're following the order of operations.